This is an RNZ podcast.
Hi, I'm Kathryn Ryan. Each week, our political commentators analyse the latest happenings in Parliament and beyond. Listen live on 9 to noon each Monday, just after the 11 o'clock news, or right here on this podcast. Let's get into it. To our political commentators now, and thank you for your patience and being with us, Liam Hehir and Neale Jones. Kia ora kōrua.
Kia ora.
Morena.
Neale was Chief of Staff to the Labour Leader Jacinda Ardern, before that Chief of Staff to Andrew Little, Director of the public affairs firm Capital, and he's also provided PR support for Andrew Little's campaign to become Mayor on a voluntary basis. Andrew Little now, of course, is Mayor. Liam Hehir is a Palmerston North lawyer, political commentator and a National Party member. I'm just trying to remember the words that Mark Mitchell used this weekend. A perpetual cycle of response and recovery. That is the reality now, it seems, Neale. And, you know, the summer before in particular.
Yeah, and look, it was only January when we had the last extreme weather event, and now it's February and we've got another one. So it seems every few months now we're having these kind of weather events that used to be considered rare and catastrophic. And I think it sort of means that increasingly we're going to see resilience and adaptation play a major part in our politics. And, you know, last time this happened back in January, Nicola Willis said that it was very political and uncouth for opposition parties to be raising the fact that they cut the $6 billion resilience and adaptation fund. But I think we are at a point now where we have to have a serious discussion as a country about how we manage this. We've got a situation where the government's cut funding. They've got a plan they've put out, which basically says, you know, by next year there'll be some flood maps.
The adaptation framework you're talking about, right. But there's legislation still to come.
But what seems to be lacking is any sense of how we're going to share the costs, who's going to pay for the challenges we face, and the money to fund things. So, I mean, a lot of, half the money the previous government's fund was about working with councils. Now you've got councils who are facing severe financial constraints, massive challenges, and are now being rate capped. They're in a financial vice. And I just don't see any real plan to give anyone confidence that this is gripped up, or any sense that people who increasingly, I think, feel insecure when they, last night my house was okay, but I was chasing my daughter's little playhouse around the front yard.
Nobody slept last night, did they?
No, I've only had a few hours.
Yeah.
So, I do think I do think they actually have to grip this up pretty quickly.
Liam, this question of adaptation, and again, it's been talked about for years and years, and it's one of those topics, I think, where people just zone out. It is right in our faces. Now there is a framework for how the government is looking towards managing it, and adaptation is things like who pays for retreat. Is there any kind of managed retreat? We've had some sense of direction from them, but how much will these repeat events really elevate this as an election issue?
Yeah, well, one thing Neil was completely right about is that the question is how do we as a country get in front of the cycle, right? So that it's not damage and repair, but how do we sort of get in front of the problem so that, we're anticipating them and being prepared when the storms hit instead of having to catch our tails all the time. And there is a genuine, I think, policy debate to be had about the best way to do it. And so, the one approach is to have a dedicated fund. I mean, my point to that would be that some of the biggest failures of the last government wasn't that it didn't fund things. So if you look at, for example, mental health, you can guarantee funding, you can put as much money, and the only thing you're really going to guarantee is that the money is going to be spent, not necessarily that it's going to be spent well. And so it is incumbent on the government to actually come through with a serious alternative, a serious framework-based alternative that shows that, there is going to be a credible plan towards getting in front of these increasingly frequent events. But I go back to, very wise, political commentator, Mr. Neale Jones, who once said that most people understand that one term is not enough to do much of anything. And we are still in that first term of government where people will give it a bit of time, but that time will start to run out as the events continue to increase in frequency.
Okay, let's have a look at some of what was making headlines before we got to yet another dramatic weather event impacting a lot of people. There's sort of a segue here, which is how you approach the question of climate policy. This is the one or the $1 billion punt on an LNG terminal. Just to remind people again, and correct me if I say anything wrong, but this isn't about supplying the general gas market so you can keep your, gas stovetop going. This is about providing firming, providing fast backup at Huntly in dry years, or when there's multiple outages at once. They've got, I think, very high levels of coal stockpile currently. This is about looking at a supply of gas to provide that service. And downstream, if it all happens downstream, likely the cost is going to end up one way or another on consumers' power bills. What did you make of this? Was it a brave move, whether you agree with it or not, Liam?
Well, I do agree with it, and I don't think it's necessarily a brave move. I do think it's a move out of necessity, just to preserve true optionality during the for the years going forward during dry winters, because you need to have the absolute security of the backup to know that if you do need to call on it, you can call on it. Now, the politics of it is one thing, and I think the idea that it's a levy, not a tax, is absolute spin from the government, that it's fair enough to criticise and call them out on that. And I think it would be better for governments to front up to the population to say actually things are going to cost money and they're going to have to be targeted taxes to pay for them, or they're going to have to come from general taxes with trade-offs. But I'm not taking a green eye shade approach to this type of thing, because really, we have seen the costs to the economy and to people of increasing energy insecurity, and anything that's going to give us a guaranteed pipeline, so to speak, during those months is something that any government has to take very, very seriously. So I'm very much in favour of it, and I'm not overly concerned about the $1 billion price tag if it comes at that.
I should note first I have clients in the electricity industry, but these views are my own. Look, I get the rationale for it, but I do have to say, rather than spending, and it could be $2 billion, there's quite a range there, plus his operating costs. I do think that if we're going to be looking at such a major investment, it would be better to look at how we can actually transfer people who don't need to be using gas off gas, so that we have sufficient gas for the for the power generation and for the industrial users that actually need it. Spending that much money locking into quite a volatile fossil fuel, which we have to import and rely on an increasingly insecure world, when we could be investing in energy sovereignty and actually lower emissions, that seems to me like a poor choice. I think the handling was particularly dreadful. It's not a great sign for the government entering election year when their first major announcement is such a fiasco. I actually went back and tracked it, and Christopher Luxon announced it saying it's a levy, not a tax, and said Labour was talking rubbish calling it a tax. Simon Watts then came out saying it wasn't a tax or a levy. Then Winston Peters came out and said, stop playing with words, it's a tax. Shane Jones came out then and said it's not a tax, and then when found out Winston's view, said, okay, it is a tax. Then David Seymour came out and said it's a levy. And then after all of that, National put up a Facebook post with Chris Hipkins as Pinocchio saying, Chris Hipkins is lying to you, this is not a tax or a levy. So
Liam, is this a case?
What is it?
But is this just a case also of focus on what people are actually interested in some way? Yes, they'll want to know if it's going to be on their bill. Call it what you like, it's going to end up on their bill. But is it going to solve a problem? Does this just show sometimes how politicians just miss what actually matters and get caught up in their own little sort of power battles?
Yeah, well, I think it's listen, it helps the politicians be able to muddy the waters, right? It's having an argument about if it's a tax or a levy is perhaps sometimes better than just admitting it's a tax and moving on to the substantive issue. But at the end of the day, it's like I said, it's a proven technology. It's nothing. It relies on technological breakthroughs. It doesn't require massive coordination of changing 1 million households, methods of heating the house and heating water. So I would much prefer to have the debate on that topic, but I don't think it necessarily hurts the government to muddy the waters. Although Neale's completely right. It's ridiculous, and it also plays into, I suppose, something else we're going to talk about today.
Well, let's go into it.
Is that lack of cohesion within the coalition.
So I do think that it sort of muddied this whole story and ended up making a distraction the key headline. One of the things I was surprised about was the fact the government was surprised by this. Remember when National was in opposition, every time the government breathed, Christopher Luxon would call it a tax. You know, the youth tax was the most famous, but there were all kinds of things that were labelled taxes and National would launch campaigns on. I feel like the simple story, and I think you touched on this, Liam, would have just been to say, we're going to save you money, we're going to provide security, there'll be a cost, but ultimately people are saving money. This is good for cost of living. And and if they say it's a tax, call it what you like, we're saving money, and you move on.
Now, staying with politics, let's just crack on. We have got a little bit of a truncated time today. Speaking of politics, and you can't take the politics out of politics, this announcement of the COVID monetary policy review that will conveniently land about a week before the election. Look, is this, I mean, it's hard to describe it as anything other than blatantly political, the timing thereof, Liam. But is it potentially going to work for National and for the Finance Minister? I suppose it depends what the report says, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of assuming that the report's going to come out to be favourable for the government or is going to endorse the government's, view of how things went, which is, cynical. Not to say that people shouldn't sometimes be cynical about politicians, but I don't think we should prejudge a report and before it comes out. I think that I would have preferred that the report have been commissioned earlier. Certainly, maybe not until after Adrian Orr had resigned, but pretty quickly afterwards. But we don't have a time machine and we can't go back and order it earlier. The question then becomes, do we get this report before the election or after it? Well, actually, if you're thinking about democracy and voters making a fully informed decision, then unless it's going to be a corrupt report, unless you're assuming the report is somehow going to be corrupted, it's better for voters to have that information before the election rather than afterwards. And so there is a degree to which I think you can criticise the timing, the delay of the report being commissioned, but I don't think that voters should be deprived of that information just because there's an assumption it might be inconvenient for the former government.
I think if you're going to do a political hit, you need to do it with some subtlety, and this had all the subtlety of a brick. And I think everyone can see exactly what this is, which means it's backfired somewhat. What's interesting is the Reserve Bank actually has done a review of the COVID period, and it's been peer-reviewed by, I think, 5 central banks. It's been paid for. It's
still
been published.
Essentially a review in itself.
But I'm saying there has been a review. It has been peer-reviewed.
Well, so it's a select committee done one, because one of my colleagues was pointing out that, previously when she was finance spokesman, Nicola Willis opposed a ComCom market study into the banking sector and said use a select committee. It's quicker. It's the resources are there.
Well, in any case, this Reserve Bank one said, yep, we could have tightened earlier, might have reduced inflation earlier, but, knowing what they knew at the time, their judgment was sound. I think this, look, have a review, find out more, but I think let's be honest about what this is. This isn't an academic study into policy settings for the future. This is about Nicola Willis playing politics at election time.
Well, if we're going to be honest about that, we also need to be honest about the implicit concern that actually it's not going to look great for Labour. If it was going to look great for Labour, if that was the feeling, then there wouldn't be the same hand-wringing about it. So either it's going to be a well-done report that's badly timed or well-timed for National, or you're assuming it's going to be a corrupted report. One of the two.
One of the things about most of National's rhetoric on COVID during the pandemic and since has been hindsight, which is something people didn't have at the time. That's why you do reviews after things happen, not before they happen. And I think what the concern is that, depending on terms of reference, we get a giant exercise in playing hindsight, which unfortunately decision makers don't have at the time.
All right, there had been a bit of delay actually in getting this announced, and you can read more on RNZ's website. My colleague, the political reporter Giles Dexter, has talked more about the timing. It was originally to have been done by March, but he explains in more detail what the explanation for that is. Look, it's such a short amount of time to talk about this issue that just keeps growing. I think what we are learning from what happened last weekend, following a rain event and the catastrophic failure, or what's it been called a number of times? I think that's been the words used, of the Moa Point facility, which has seen sewage pumped out into Wellington's, out into Cook Strait and out into Wellington's waterways. What are the wider implications that are becoming clear now? The implications for the government's very water reforms that were part way through, Liam. Is this going to raise questions beyond this specific incident?
Yeah, well, I just have to go back to the very wise words of Neale Jones. Most people understand that one term is not enough to do much of anything. And government did scrap Three Waters, that's true, but this would have happened with or without Three Waters. Three Waters was a governance reform. It wasn't a time machine. And this does reflect, years and years and years of underinvestment. It's interesting that it happened, interesting, but also, it's telling that it's another disaster in Wellington. I do some legal work for local governments, but that's all on the commercial side rather than anything on this side of things. But I can tell you, as a Manawatu ratepayer, there's been huge amounts of investments in this type of infrastructure, which is why rates in Fielding are slightly more expensive than rates in Wellington. And this is a result of years and years of democratic process. The government is at some point going to have to come up with actually a model and show that its preferred model of more localism is actually going to be viable and is going to work. But I don't think you can really blame the government for something this long in the making.
I'm not suggesting that the government's at fault for the Moa Point disaster. That would be a bit partisan for any commentator. I should note I have a personal connection to the Mayor's office in Wellington. Look, I think that what it speaks to is the broader challenge of water infrastructure in New Zealand. Christchurch has got a contamination issue right now. Wellington's not the only place historically that's had issues. We all remember the Hawke's Bay contamination disaster. What we're seeing here, though, with local water done well is you're having councils having to sort of patch together these new water entities with no real money behind it, with massively underinvested assets at a time of growing climate problems. We don't know yet what the cause of the Moa Point disaster was.
This is the other issue.
But it was during heavy rains.
Well, we're learning a lot about the performance failures in the regular sort of reporting that was being done.
Yeah, there was real issues in performance and reporting.
The monitoring, the oversight of the company doing it. We need to await inquiries to find that out.
Yeah.
But my broader question was the implications for this wider... I mean, at a domestic level, there's a bunch of councils sitting around the Wellington region wondering whether they particularly want to come in and be paying for this, right?
Yeah, and I think how people will judge local water done well is, does it fix the problem and what is the cost? And, people in Wellington, for example, are going to start getting water bills very soon. Those water bills are going to be eye-watering, and they're probably going to keep rising. And if you look at the state of that infrastructure, I suspect that's going to be how people judge local water done well. If the government hadn't scrapped Three Waters, we would have larger entities with larger balance sheets with an implicit government guarantee that would have been able to get cheaper access to capital and greater amount of economies of scale. I think the government played politics because the people were scared about Māori having interest in the water, and now we're all paying the price for it.
Liam?
Yeah. They'd be high-performing entities just like Health New Zealand and the Polytech. It would be perfect.
You wanted to talk about what's happening within the coalition at the moment. We had the ACT leaders' speeches, State of the Nation speeches, which got itself some coverage yesterday. We've had the leader of New Zealand First, the Foreign Minister, Winston Peters First. There was the opposition to the India Free Trade deal that they wouldn't be voting for it. Now we're waiting for Labour to commit. It's got some caveats. It's made public at the weekend. Mr Peters also now weighing in on the Māori seats and again saying time for a referendum on them. Let's take it out of the specific and look at the dynamics with the coalition, both how it's communicating as a government right now, Liam, but also what's about to happen now we get into an election year.
Yeah, well, less than in previous years, ironically. I think that the sort of what ACT and New Zealand First have done all along this whole term is to be the bad boys the whole time. And before the 2020 election, a New Zealand First person actually rang me up and said, "Oh, look at this! You just watch. We're going to differentiate ourselves from the government this time around. In the next 6 months, we're really going to come out against Labour, and we're going to get a big bump in the polls." And of course, it's not credible to do that. What is more credible from a MMP perspective is to actually push each other the whole way through as much as you can. And we've had so many sessions on here where we've talked about how New Zealand First and ACT both have pushed the edge all the way, and it's been to their benefit. But what it hasn't been, it's been a huge detriment to National, right? And so we're coming into a first-term re-election, or the first re-election, and for most of New Zealand's MMP history, the government, the main governing party, gets this huge centrist dividend that sort of, where the small party sort of collapses and then the centre comes in, and actually National's getting none of that dividend. They're getting none of that bonus.
It's interesting. We've got a wrap, but just an observation on that. Thanks, Liam. I don't know whether you want to comment on or not, Neale, is part of that by stitching up some sort of stability with the first full three-party coalition, National also ceded so much policy and airtime to them.
I think Christopher Luxon in the coalition agreement gave a series of culture war sort of wins to New Zealand First and ACT, which came to dominate the airwaves, which meant his story's been subsumed. And if you see Winston Peters pushing on the Māori seats referendum, I think you're going to see a bit of a bidding war between ACT and New Zealand First. Winston's going to go hard on immigration, he's going to go hard on the treaty. And I think ACT will struggle to match that. In their heart of hearts, ACT don't believe in this stuff. You know, their actual core ideology, there's probably a support base of about 1%. And I think that vote that's concerned about the treaty and other culture issues, I think they go to New Zealand First, and we see quite a different setup post-election.
And a challenge for National, some commentators pointing out a reasonably thoughtful speech from the Prime Minister at Waitangi on his perspective on where things are at, and I don't remember seeing a word of it reported.
No, it just gets lost. And I mean, David Seymour and Winston Peters are very effective communicators. They really know how to capture attention, which is the key thing in politics these days, and Luxon just gets lost.
Thanks, both of you. Really appreciate it. That's Neale Jones. Also, thanks to Liam Hehir.